America has built some of the most celebrated businesses like Starbucks, Apple, Amazon. These companies are gigantic, but they always start from one singular person having an idea and putting in the effort. To me, startups are the purest form of opportunity. If you have an idea and you work hard at it and you constantly put effort in and you put in the hours and passion and everything, the company should succeed. That is what makes startups so exciting. My name is Tim Hwang, founder and CEO of FiscalNote. FiscalNote is a legal and information data and company where we collect laws and regulations and help people to understand how laws potentially impact their organizations. We service everyone from the White House, the CDC. We raised probably about $250 million in venture capital from folks like Mark Cuban, Jerry Yang. We recently went public for over $1 billion. To the subscribers of EO, we're definitely interested in talking about the challenges of building a company in the US, B2B market and startup landscape, and of course, how to build a unicorn startup globally. Yeah, enjoy. For me, I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur, to be honest. Ever since I was in middle school and high school, my dream was to go to law school, become a prosecutor, and then run for political office and become a politician. And to me, business was always a practical way to make an impact. And then when I was about 16 or 17, a friend of mine called me and he said, there's this guy, he's running for president, you should check him out. He has a really funny name, but he's a really, really interesting guy. So I went online and I watched his speech. And I felt like even if he doesn't become president, I feel like we should actually try and make him become president. And so I actually ended up working for Senator Obama's presidential campaign back in 2007, 2008. It was such a life-changing experience because it was like one big startup. We had to build offices in all 50 states. The campaign had to raise about $1 billion in capital, and then we had to deploy it to consumers, about 300 million Americans, within about 12 months. That idea of basically, sleeping in the back of the office with pizza boxes and, working till 2 or 3 in the morning and trying to get someone elected, I think that was a very energizing experience. As I was going into college in 2010, just started getting involved in startups. And I felt like this is the place where I want to be. Because in politics, at least, you'd spend years and years and years trying to make change in the political system. But in startups, at least, you can essentially very, very quickly build a product, get it to market, help customers, and change their lives. So at the time, I just finished my degree at Princeton and then just started actually my MBA at Harvard. When I had the idea for FiscalNote, I was extremely focused on making sure that the company was going to succeed. We had sort of a vision of where we wanted to be, and it was just pure execution at that point, and everything else was sort of noise to me at the end of the day. So after we raised our seed round of capital, it was like, I'm never going to go back to school. We've raised millions of dollars. We have, dozens of employees. We have to actually make this a success. The way that we make decisions, and particularly the first decision when we started the company, was what is a real truth that is not going to change in 20 or 30 years? Will the world become more complex or less complex? Will the world become more politically challenging or less politically challenging? To me, it was so obvious that the world was heading in a direction where it was going to become much more complex, where politics was going to be much more important. The problem was very clear. When you talk to customers, they're just overwhelmed with regulations and the complexity of politics. Maybe 20 years ago, CEOs didn't have to care that much about politics. That's like something else that's going on over there. Today, if there's a political issue, they always bring the microphone and they ask CEO, what is your opinion? The one unique thing that we got right was we picked a macro trend that was never going to change. Is we essentially take laws and regulations from each and every country around the world. We collect it using AI, and then we use kind of machine learning, natural language processing to be able to help people to process that information, search information, eventually make decisions based off of that data. You can think of it almost like the Bloomberg terminal for law. So our first round of investment we raised at the end of 2013. To be honest, we had just built a product. It was a tiny little product. And we said, okay, we really need to expand this business because we were working out of a Motel 6 in Silicon Valley. One night, actually, I was watching Shark Tank, the TV show. And it was my co-founders and I were sleeping in this motel room and we were just looking at TV. I was like, oh man, wouldn't it be so great if Mark Cuban invested in our company? The next day, I actually went on Google and I typed in Google Mark Cuban email address. And then I went to the contact us page of his TV company. And right there was his email address. So I shot him a 3 or 4 sentence email. Subject line was changing government. And then in the email, I said, my name's Tim. I just graduated from college. I'm starting this company. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to change the world. And he responded within 45 minutes. And so, Mark Cuban and I, we went back and forth over email for a couple of days, and he said, okay, great. I want to do it. I'm going to invest. He said, how much are you raising? At the time we were raising $740,000 because we had exactly calculated how much we need for 12 months. And he said, I'll do the whole thing. Mark was our very, very first investor. That was our first little kind of venture round. It came together very quickly, and to be honest, I feel like we were extremely lucky, but that definitely changed our lives for sure. The reason why a lot of founders struggle to get investment, a lot of founders, particularly first-time founders, they don't know what is an investable company, what is a not investable company. What a lot of founders need need to do is they need to educate themselves on the particular interests of this investor. There's many, many, many different types of investors, B2C investors, B2B investors. If you are starting a consumer company, B2C company, you definitely should not email a B2B investor because they're not going to be interested. And a lot of the venture investing mindset is very pattern recognition oriented. They're very, very interested in trying to invest like this other company. It's like A, we should invest in B, which is why a lot of startup founders say it's Uber for this or Airbnb for that. These investors are looking for individual things in an investable business. They're looking at the business model, the future profitability. If you're going to be the CEO of a company, you need to know all of those things. It's your responsibility to understand that market, understand the investable landscape, and then to actually try and build a company in that general context. We started this company when we were 21 years old. We were straight out of college. We had zero network. We have zero connection to Wall Street, zero connection to Silicon Valley, zero connection to kind of major American companies. We built that network ourselves, literally going on LinkedIn and then one person at a time, reaching out to them, getting a warm intro, literally going to cocktail parties, forcing our way in the back door and then shaking people's hands and taking their business cards. We hustled really hard. It was a very, very effort-driven mechanism to essentially build that network. Any business requires a huge level of network. If you want to build a successful B2C company as well, eventually you're going to need to do B2B work, whether it's with advertisers or with partners or whatnot. Of course, network is going to matter quite a lot. We definitely didn't have an aha moment, and it was actually very unsexy. It was really just pure hard work and effort, just trying to get to the right answers as quickly as possible. We had a Google spreadsheet, and on this Google spreadsheet, we listed out 2,000 company names, and we literally bought a phone from 7-Eleven, and we called, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies, and we asked them, do you have this problem? Do you have this problem? Can you spend 5 minutes with us? Can you take 10 minutes with us? And so when we built the product, it was after maybe 100 or 200 conversations, people who had this particular problem and needed this particular issue solved. Our first customer was a defense contractor. So I think that from that perspective, we got validation very quickly. They came in, they paid $20,000. We knew, we actually still in our office have the contract framed, because if we could get one customer, we could definitely get 10 customers. And if we get 100 customers, we can definitely get 1,000 customers. 1,000 customers, you essentially become a unicorn. I think that we have a competitive advantage in technology. The investments that we made in AI essentially prove that, collectively, we can build a company and a product that our customers want. Let's say you're a pharma company. Pharma companies, they're trying to understand what their competitors are thinking about, what the government is thinking about. And so for us, who's sitting actually at the center of everything, we have the FDA as a customer, we have the CDC as a customer. I can tell you from our perspective, oh, by the way, the FDA is going to pass this regulation. You should probably look at this. So you essentially become experts in that particular policy arena. The companies, they essentially they rely on you to kind of provide that intelligence. And to be totally candid, there are many, many points where FiscalNote could have failed. But in the back of my head, I would always say that failure is not an option. We're going to do whatever it takes to make this a success. That pure raging determination is probably what enabled the company to sort of get to this point today. When we were founding FiscalNote, I was 21 years old. I was Series A founder by the time I was 22. We were managing a 100% company by the time I was like 24. It was like very, very, very rapid growth. To be totally honest, I don't come from an extremely wealthy family. Parents grew up pretty modestly. They came to the US speaking almost no English. I grew up in the US. I went to school in the US. I went to college in the US. I work in the US. But there's sort of the sense of not being American. It's a challenge because there exists in the business culture a kind of invisible club. Imagine there's a very, very exclusive club. Trying to break into this club has been, something that I've been trying to do for the last, 10 or 15 years. You definitely get ignored a lot. People assume that you're not going to be a great executive or a great communicator. They probably think that you're some engineer. And I think it's also very lonely. I was at a dinner, this is a dinner of all of the CEOs in the DC area. And I was looking around the room and I was the only Asian person in the entire room. I texted my co-founder, I was like, dude, this is so messed up. How am I the only Asian in this room? And there's sort of circles of like 5 or 6 CEOs, typically Caucasian men, and they're all like sort of drinking in there. You're trying to like walk into the little circle and like make conversation, and they sort of look at you and they ignore you. Even though, to be honest, I think our company is probably one of the biggest companies in that room. When we were starting FiscalNote, we knew that we are disadvantaged, that we were gonna have to work much harder and try much harder. If you wanna get covered by the press, you're gonna have to contact 10 times more reporters. If you wanna get investment, you're gonna have to contact 10 times more VCs, because you're probably gonna get ignored. I think that probably gave us a little bit more of a drive to want to put in more effort. To me, startups are the purest form of opportunity. If you have an idea and you work hard at it and you constantly put effort in and you put in the hours and passion and everything, the company should succeed. That is what makes startups so exciting. People ask me like, why do you think America is so great at startups, right? I think it's because the startup culture has always been in America. America has built some of the most celebrated businesses like Starbucks, Apple, Amazon. These companies are gigantic, but they always start from one singular person having an idea and putting in the effort. The emerging generation, sort of 20s and 30s right now, I think has a sense of disillusion. They feel like there's not enough hope or not enough economic opportunity. I think that startups are the answer. They are the economic torchlight that can guide the future of economies. And how do you connect the dot between the hope and disillusionment of 20s and 30s and the future of kind of economic opportunity comes down to starting businesses. Building startups that solve problems, that go out there and essentially are able to scale. You know, I think FiscalNote is still a very small company, in my opinion. We have a goal right now to try and get to $500 million, $1 billion in revenues as quickly as possible. You know, when we hit 100 million in sales, I told our executive team, take this day to celebrate, but we need to now focus on hitting $1 billion in sales. When you sort of think in that way, $1 billion sales company means that you have to build 10 $100 million sales company inside of that business. When you sort of put it that way, people start to think, okay, what new businesses do we need to enter? What new joint ventures do we need to invest in? You know, what new product do we need to create? And it's still a very, very kind of large mindset for the business. And so I just turned 30 years old, and I feel like this is the beginning of my career, to be honest. Even though for the last 7 or 8 years we've been building this company, Jeff Bezos was 30, 31 years old when he founded Amazon. I still have a very, very long career that I'd like for me to sort of embark upon. And I think it starts, of course, with making sure that FiscalNote is successful and has the pathway to become an even greater company than it is today.